You know what's the most painful moment for someone who lost you? It's not when you leave, it's when they realize you're never coming back. Seneca wrote that true freedom begins when we stop begging for crumbs of attention from those who only serve us leftovers. The ancient Stoics knew something that modern psychology is just beginning to understand. There's a specific mental transformation that makes a person literally unreachable, not out of pride or hurt, but through genuine evolution. In the next few minutes, I'll share the 5 Stoic laws that completely reprogram your mind, eliminate your need for external validation, and create an emotional fortress so powerful that your indifference becomes magnetic. Those who underestimated you will spend sleepless nights trying to understand how you became so strong. Subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and comment which part of the world you're watching from. Relax and get comfortable. Let's begin. There comes a moment in every person's life when they realize that the path they've been walking, the constant search for approval from others, the endless cycle of seeking validation from external sources, simply isn't leading them to the fulfillment they desperately crave. Perhaps you've reached that moment now. Perhaps you've grown tired of the emotional roller coaster that comes with depending on others for your sense of worth. Perhaps you've recognized that true strength, the kind that weathers any storm and remains unshakable regardless of circumstances, must come from within. The ancient Stoics understood this profound truth centuries ago. They recognized that human beings possess an incredible capacity for inner transformation, a power so profound that it can completely reshape not just how we see ourselves, but how we experience every aspect of our existence. This isn't about becoming cold or indifferent to the world around us. This is about discovering a wellspring of strength within yourself that no external circumstance can touch, no criticism can diminish, and no rejection can destroy. When we speak of Stoic philosophy, we're not talking about suppressing emotions or becoming emotionally numb. We're talking about developing what the ancient philosophers called emotional resilience, the ability to experience life fully while maintaining your inner equilibrium. Think of it like learning to swim in turbulent waters. The waves will still come, the currents will still pull, but you develop the skill to navigate them without being overwhelmed, without drowning in the chaos of external circumstances. The journey toward true personal power begins with a fundamental shift in perspective. Most people spend their entire lives focused outward, constantly measuring their worth against the opinions of others, seeking happiness in achievements that depend on factors beyond their control, building their identity on foundations that can crumble at any moment. But the Stoic path invites you to turn your attention inward, to discover the unassailable fortress of strength that exists within your own character, your own choices, your own responses to whatever life presents. This inner fortress isn't built overnight, and it isn't constructed through wishful thinking or positive affirmations alone. It's built through the daily practice of focusing your energy and attention on what the Stoics called your sphere of choice. Every moment of every day, you face countless situations that are completely outside your control. The weather, other people's actions, unexpected events, economic conditions, social trends, the past, the future, all of these lie beyond your direct influence. But in every single moment, there exists something that remains entirely within your power: how you choose to respond. This might seem like a small thing, but it's actually the most revolutionary concept in all of human psychology. When you truly understand that your responses are always your choice, regardless of what's happening around you, you step into a realm of personal power that most people never even realize exists. You're no longer at the mercy of circumstances. You're no longer dependent on others behaving in certain ways for you to feel good about yourself. You're no longer waiting for external conditions to align perfectly before you can access your own sense of peace and contentment. Consider for a moment how much of your emotional energy you've spent over the years trying to control things that were never actually under your control. How many sleepless nights have you endured worrying about what others might think of your decisions? How many times have you changed course, not because your inner wisdom guided you in a new direction, but because you feared disapproval or rejection? How often have you held back from pursuing something meaningful to you, because you couldn't guarantee the outcome would meet with others' approval. The Stoic philosophers would tell you that every moment spent trying to control the uncontrollable is a moment of your precious life energy wasted. But more than that, it's a moment when you're unconsciously training yourself to be weak, dependent, and reactive. Every time you allow external circumstances to determine your internal state, you're reinforcing patterns that make you less capable of accessing your own innate strength and wisdom. But there's another way to live, a way that the greatest minds in history have discovered and practiced. It's the way of the person who has learned to find their center regardless of what storms may rage around them. This person doesn't ignore the external world or pretend that circumstances don't matter. They simply refuse to let external circumstances determine their internal reality. They understand that true freedom isn't the absence of challenges or difficulties, but the presence of an unshakable inner strength that can meet whatever comes with grace and wisdom. This transformation doesn't happen through force or struggle. It happens through a gradual process of redirecting your attention from what you cannot control to what you can control. It happens through developing the skill of emotional regulation, not by suppressing your feelings, but by choosing your responses consciously rather than reactively. It happens through cultivating what the Stoics called virtue, which isn't moral righteousness in the conventional sense, but rather the excellence of character that comes from consistently choosing wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation in your daily life. The beautiful thing about this path is that it doesn't require perfect circumstances to begin. You don't need to wait until your external life is arranged exactly as you want it. You don't need others' permission or approval. You don't need special resources or credentials. The only requirement is your willingness to take responsibility for your own inner development and to gradually shift your focus from trying to control your external world to mastering your internal world. When you begin to live this way, something remarkable happens. The opinions of others, while perhaps still interesting or relevant in certain contexts, lose their power to destabilize you. Criticism becomes feedback that you can consider or dismiss based on your own judgment, rather than something that automatically triggers self-doubt or defensiveness. Praise becomes pleasant but unnecessary for your sense of self-worth. Rejection stops feeling like a verdict on your value as a human being and becomes simply information about compatibility or timing. This doesn't mean you become indifferent to relationships or disconnected from others. In fact, the opposite often happens. When you're no longer desperately seeking validation from others, you become free to connect with them more authentically. When you're not constantly worried about their approval, you can be more genuinely yourself in their presence. When you're not dependent on their behavior for your happiness, you can appreciate them for who they are, rather than constantly trying to manipulate them into being who you need them to be. The Stoic concept of preferred indifference offers a powerful framework for understanding this balance. There are things in life that we naturally prefer: health over sickness, prosperity over poverty, friendship over loneliness. These preferences are normal and healthy, but the Stoic learns to hold these preferences lightly, recognizing that their happiness and inner peace don't depend on getting what they prefer. They can work toward their preferred outcomes while remaining emotionally stable, regardless of whether they achieve them. This might sound like settling for less or giving up on your dreams, but it's actually the opposite. When you're not emotionally attached to specific outcomes, you often perform better in pursuing them. When you're not paralyzed by the fear of failure or rejection, you're more likely to take the risks necessary for meaningful achievement. When your sense of self-worth isn't riding on external results, you're free to experiment, learn, and grow in ways that would be too threatening if your identity depended on always succeeding. The practice of developing this inner strength requires daily attention, but it doesn't require dramatic life changes or heroic gestures. It starts with small moments of choice throughout your day. When someone cuts you off in traffic, you can choose your response rather than reacting automatically. When you receive criticism, you can pause and consider it thoughtfully rather than immediately defending or attacking. When you face uncertainty about the future, you can acknowledge your concerns while refusing to let anxiety dominate your present moment experience. Each of these small choices is like a deposit in a bank account of personal strength. Over time, these deposits compound, creating a reservoir of resilience and wisdom that you can draw upon in more challenging situations. You begin to discover that you're capable of remaining calm in circumstances that used to overwhelm you. You find that you can pursue your goals with passionate commitment while holding the outcomes lightly. You realize that your happiness and peace of mind are portable qualities that travel with you regardless of what's happening around you. The ancient Stoics often spoke of life as a performance, but not in the sense of putting on an act or being inauthentic. They meant that we each have a role to play as friends, family members, professionals, citizens, and that excellence comes from performing our roles with skill and integrity rather than seeking applause from the audience. When you fully embrace this perspective, you discover the freedom that comes from intrinsic motivation rather than external validation. This shift in orientation affects every aspect of your existence. Your career becomes about doing meaningful work well rather than impressing others or accumulating status symbols. Your relationships become about genuine connection and mutual growth rather than getting your emotional needs met or proving your worth. Your personal development becomes about becoming the person you're capable of being rather than fitting into others' expectations or societal templates. The journey toward this kind of inner strength and independence isn't always comfortable. There will be moments when the old patterns of seeking external validation feel more familiar and safer than the new path of inner-directed living. There will be times when other people don't understand or appreciate your newfound independence and may even try to pull you back into old dynamics of dependency and reactivity. There will be challenges that test your resolve and make you question whether this path of inner development is worth the effort. But every time you choose to respond from your center rather than react from your conditioning, every time you choose your own values over others' expectations, every time you find peace within yourself rather than seeking it in external circumstances, you're not just improving your own life, you're becoming an example to other human beings. You're demonstrating that it's possible to live with dignity, wisdom, and strength, regardless of what the world throws at you. This is the promise of Stoic philosophy and the path of inner development. Not that life will become easy or that you'll never face difficulties, but that you'll develop the inner resources to meet whatever comes with grace and wisdom. Not that you'll stop caring about others or become indifferent to outcomes, but that your caring will come from strength rather than neediness, and your preferences won't hold you hostage to circumstances beyond your control. The person you can become through this practice is someone who moves through the world with quiet confidence, who contributes to others from fullness rather than seeking to fill an inner void, who faces uncertainty with curiosity rather than anxiety, and who builds a life based on their own deepest values rather than the shifting opinions of the crowd. This person is not beyond the reach of ordinary human beings. This person is who you already are beneath the layers of conditioning and habit that have convinced you that your worth depends on external factors. The journey toward this inner discovery begins with one of the most radical shifts in perspective that any human being can make: the recognition that your emotional state, your sense of peace, and your fundamental well-being are not dependent on external circumstances arranging themselves according to your preferences. This shift feels radical because it goes against everything our culture teaches us about happiness and success. We're conditioned to believe that our inner state should fluctuate based on what's happening around us, that it's normal and even appropriate to feel anxious when things are uncertain, upset when people disappoint us, and elated when external validation comes our way. But the ancient Stoics discovered something that modern psychology is only now beginning to understand. This reactive way of living keeps us in a state of perpetual vulnerability, constantly at the mercy of forces beyond our control. When your happiness depends on other people's behavior, on economic conditions, on whether your plans work out exactly as you envision them, you're essentially handing over the keys to your inner kingdom to forces that have no investment in your well-being and no ability to truly understand what you need to flourish. The alternative isn't to become indifferent or to stop caring about outcomes entirely. The alternative is to develop what we might call emotional sovereignty, the capacity to maintain your center regardless of what's swirling around you. This sovereignty isn't built through denial or suppression of feeling, but through a fundamental shift in where you locate your source of stability and strength. Instead of looking outward for signs that everything is going to be okay, you learn to generate that sense of okayness from within. This process requires understanding the difference between what the Stoics called impressions and judgment. An impression is simply what happens. Someone criticizes your work. You don't get the promotion you wanted. A relationship ends unexpectedly. These impressions are neutral events until you add your interpretation to them. The judgment is the story you tell yourself about what these events mean about you, your worth, your future, or your capabilities. The impression says someone criticized your work. The judgment says you're incompetent or not good enough. The impression says you didn't get the promotion. The judgment says you're a failure or that your efforts are worthless. The profound realization at the heart of Stoic practice is that you have complete control over your judgments, even when you have no control over the impressions that trigger them. This doesn't mean you can simply think positive thoughts and make all your problems disappear. It means you can learn to examine the stories you automatically tell yourself about what happens to you and choose more wisdom-based interpretations that serve your long-term flourishing rather than your immediate emotional reactions. When you receive criticism, for instance, you can choose to interpret it as information to consider rather than as an attack on your fundamental worth. When you face uncertainty about the future, you can choose to see it as an opportunity to practice adaptability rather than as evidence that you're not in control and therefore not safe. When someone else succeeds in an area where you've been struggling, you can choose to see their success as proof that success is possible rather than as evidence that you're inadequate by comparison. These shifts in interpretation aren't about lying to yourself or engaging in wishful thinking. They're about choosing responses that actually serve your ability to function effectively in the world. When you interpret criticism as useful information rather than personal attack, you're more likely to learn from it and improve. When you view uncertainty as normal rather than threatening, you're more likely to remain calm and make good decisions even when you can't predict outcomes. When you see others' success as inspiring rather than diminishing, you're more likely to learn from their example and persist in your own efforts. The cultivation of this kind of interpretive wisdom requires what the Stoics called the discipline of desire. This discipline isn't about suppressing your wants or becoming ascetic, but about learning to desire what actually leads to human flourishing, rather than what temporarily soothes your ego or provides momentary pleasure. Most people desire external validation, material success, and certainty about the future, because these things seem to offer security and happiness. But the Stoic learns to desire virtue, wisdom, courage, justice, and moderation, because these qualities provide a foundation for well-being that doesn't depend on circumstances aligning in any particular way. When wisdom becomes something you actively desire and pursue, you find yourself naturally gravitating toward choices that develop your capacity for sound judgment, rather than choices that simply feel good in the moment. When courage becomes a quality you genuinely want to embody, you find yourself willing to face difficult situations rather than avoiding them or hoping someone else will handle them for you. When justice becomes something you actively seek to practice, your relationships improve because you're focused on contributing rather than taking, on understanding rather than being understood. This reorientation toward virtue as the primary good in human life creates a kind of inner stability that no external circumstance can shake. Your sense of self-worth becomes based on how well you're living according to your highest values, rather than on how well external circumstances are matching your preferences. Your happiness becomes rooted in the satisfaction of acting with integrity and wisdom rather than in getting what you want or avoiding what you don't want. The practical implications of this shift are enormous. Instead of spending your energy trying to control other people's behavior, you spend it on developing your own character. Instead of worrying about outcomes you can't guarantee, you focus on performing your actions with excellence and then accepting whatever results. Instead of seeking relationships that make you feel good about yourself, you seek to become someone who contributes positively to the relationships you're already in. This doesn't mean you become passive or stop working toward goals that matter to you. It means you approach your goals from a position of inner strength rather than inner neediness. You pursue achievements because they align with your values and allow you to express your capabilities not because you need them to prove your worth or earn others' approval. You work to improve your circumstances because you want to create value in the world and live comfortably, not because you can't be happy unless certain conditions are met. The person who has developed this kind of inner-directed approach to life experiences a freedom that most people can barely imagine. They're free from the constant anxiety of wondering what others think of them. They're free from the emotional volatility that comes with having your mood depend on external circumstances. They're free from the resentment that builds up when you're constantly trying to change things beyond your control. They're free from the depression that comes from defining yourself by your failures and setbacks. But perhaps, most importantly, they're free to be genuinely themselves in every situation. When you're not constantly performing for approval or trying to manage others' impressions of you, you can show up authentically in your relationships. When you're not afraid of criticism or rejection, you can take risks that allow you to grow and contribute in meaningful ways. When you're not attached to specific outcomes, you can pursue your goals with passionate commitment while remaining open to unexpected opportunities and lessons that arise along the way. The development of this authenticity requires practicing what the Stoics called the discipline of action. This discipline involves learning to act from your own values and judgment rather than from social pressure, emotional reactivity, or the desire for immediate gratification. It means developing the capacity to do what you believe is right, even when it's difficult, unpopular, or doesn't provide immediate rewards. Most people struggle with the discipline of action because they've been conditioned to seek approval and avoid discomfort. They make decisions based on what others will think rather than what they believe is wise. They avoid difficult conversations, challenging projects, or situations that might result in failure because the temporary discomfort feels more real to them than the long-term benefits of facing difficulties with courage and integrity. But when you begin to practice the discipline of action consistently, something remarkable happens. You discover that you're much more capable than you realized. Situations that used to seem overwhelming become manageable when you approach them from a place of inner stability rather than emotional reactivity. Problems that used to trigger anxiety become interesting challenges when you're not attached to solving them in any particular way or time frame. The key to developing this discipline lies in starting with small actions that align with your values, even when they're inconvenient or uncomfortable. If you value honesty, you practice telling the truth in small situations where it would be easier to be evasive or deceptive. If you value courage, you practice speaking up in meetings or having difficult conversations that you would normally avoid. If you value self-discipline, you practice doing things you've committed to do even when you don't feel like doing them. Each time you choose your values over your immediate comfort or social pressure, you're building what we might call moral muscle, the capacity to act according to your principles, regardless of external circumstances. This muscle strengthens with use, just like physical muscles, and eventually becomes strong enough to support you through major life challenges and decisions. The beautiful thing about this approach to personal development is that it doesn't require you to wait for perfect circumstances or other people's cooperation. You can begin practicing virtue right where you are, with whatever challenges you're currently facing. Every day provides countless opportunities to choose wisdom over reactivity, courage over avoidance, justice over selfishness, moderation over excess. Every interaction with another person is a chance to practice authenticity rather than people-pleasing or manipulation. As you develop these capacities, you begin to experience what the Stoics called inner freedom, the recognition that regardless of what happens to you, you retain the power to choose your responses and therefore to shape your experience of life from the inside out. This freedom doesn't eliminate suffering or guarantee that you'll get everything you want, but it provides a foundation of strength that allows you to navigate whatever comes with grace and wisdom. The cultivation of inner freedom also transforms your relationship with time itself. Instead of constantly living in the future, worried about outcomes you can't control, or stuck in the past, replaying regrets and resentments, you become increasingly able to inhabit the present moment fully. You realize that the present is actually the only place where you have any power. You can't change the past, you can't control the future, but you can choose how to respond to this moment right now. This present moment awareness isn't about becoming disconnected from planning for the future or learning from the past. It's about recognizing that both planning and learning can only happen in the present, and that your power to shape your life exists entirely in your current choices and responses. When you truly understand this, you stop postponing your happiness until circumstances improve and start accessing the satisfaction that comes from living according to your highest values right now, regardless of what's happening around you. This present moment power becomes the foundation for what might be the most transformative aspect of Stoic practice: the gradual dissolution of the false self that has been constructed through years of seeking external validation and avoiding discomfort. Most people spend their entire lives building and defending an identity that is essentially a collection of other people's opinions, social roles, achievements, and carefully curated experiences designed to create a particular impression. This constructed self requires constant maintenance and protection, which is exhausting and ultimately futile because it's built on foundations that can shift or disappear at any moment. The process of dismantling this false self isn't about becoming nobody or losing your personality. It's about discovering who you actually are beneath all the layers of conditioning, expectation, and performance that have accumulated over the years. This authentic self doesn't need constant validation because it isn't dependent on external recognition for its sense of worth. It doesn't need to avoid certain experiences because it isn't threatened by discomfort, failure, or criticism. It doesn't need to control outcomes because it finds meaning in the process of living according to its values rather than in achieving specific results. The discovery of this authentic self requires what the Stoics called the discipline of perception, which involves learning to see reality as it actually is, rather than as your fears, desires, and conditioning would have you perceive it. Most of our suffering comes not from what actually happens to us, but from the stories we tell ourselves about what happens to us. These stories are usually based on assumptions about what certain events mean, predictions about what they will lead to, and judgments about whether they're good or bad for us. For example, when you lose a job, the objective reality is simply that your employment situation has changed. But the stories you might tell yourself could include, "This means I'm not good enough. This proves I'll never be successful. This is going to ruin my future. People will think less of me. I should have seen this coming," and countless other interpretations that add layers of suffering to what is already a challenging situation. The discipline of perception involves learning to separate the objective facts from these interpretive stories and choosing interpretations that serve your ability to respond effectively, rather than ones that trigger emotional spirals. This doesn't mean adopting unrealistic optimism or pretending that difficult situations are actually wonderful opportunities in disguise. It means learning to see situations clearly without the distortions that come from ego protection, catastrophic thinking, or wishful thinking. When you can see what's actually happening without all the mental commentary, you're much more likely to respond in ways that serve your long-term interests and align with your values. The practice of clear perception reveals something remarkable. Most of the things we spend our time worrying about are either completely outside our control or much less significant than our emotional reactions make them seem. The colleague who seems to dislike you may simply be dealing with personal challenges that have nothing to do with you. The criticism you received may contain useful information that can help you improve, regardless of the spirit in which it was delivered. The uncertainty you're facing about the future may be an opportunity to develop greater adaptability and trust in your ability to handle whatever comes. This clarity of perception naturally leads to what the Stoics considered the highest human capacity, the ability to respond rather than react. Reacting is automatic, unconscious, driven by conditioning and emotion. Responding is conscious, intentional, guided by wisdom and values. The space between stimulus and response is where human freedom exists, and expanding that space is perhaps the most important work any person can do for their own development and for their contribution to the world. When someone criticizes you and you immediately defend yourself or attack back, you're reacting. When someone criticizes you and you pause, consider whether there's truth in what they're saying, and then choose how to respond based on what would be most helpful for everyone involved. You're responding. The difference might seem subtle, but it's the difference between being unconsciously controlled by your conditioning and consciously directing your life according to your highest values. Developing the capacity to respond rather than react requires cultivating what we might call emotional spaciousness, the ability to feel your emotions without being overwhelmed by them, to acknowledge your initial impulses without being compelled to act on them, to remain aware of your values and long-term goals, even when you're experiencing strong feelings. This spaciousness isn't created by suppressing emotions or pretending they don't matter. It's created by developing a larger sense of identity that can contain emotional experiences without being defined by them. Think of it like learning to be a good parent to yourself. A good parent doesn't ignore their child's emotions or dismiss them as unimportant, but they also don't let the child's emotions dictate all the family's decisions. They acknowledge the feelings, offer comfort and understanding, and then make decisions based on what they believe is best for the child's long-term development and well-being. Similarly, you can learn to acknowledge your emotional reactions with compassion while making choices based on your adult wisdom rather than your immediate emotional impulses. This internal parenting requires developing what the Stoics called the inner citadel, a place within yourself that remains untouchable regardless of what's happening in your external circumstances. This citadel isn't a place of hiding or withdrawal from life, but rather a source of strength and stability that allows you to engage more fully with whatever challenges and opportunities arise. When you know that there's a part of you that can't be damaged by criticism, rejection, failure, or loss, you become free to take risks, be vulnerable, and pursue meaningful goals without being paralyzed by fear. The inner citadel is built through the daily practice of small acts of self-discipline and value-based decision-making. Each time you choose to do something you've committed to do, even when you don't feel like doing it, you're strengthening your capacity for self-governance. Each time you choose honesty over convenience, courage over comfort, or generosity over selfishness, you're reinforcing your ability to live according to your principles rather than your impulses. Each time you choose to interpret difficult situations in ways that serve your growth rather than your ego, you're expanding your emotional resilience. These practices might seem minor when taken individually, but they compound over time into a fundamental transformation in how you experience life. Instead of feeling like a victim of circumstances, you begin to feel like an active participant in shaping your experience. Instead of feeling dependent on others for your sense of worth and happiness, you develop confidence in your ability to create meaning and satisfaction from within. Instead of feeling anxious about the future or regretful about the past, you become increasingly comfortable with uncertainty and focused on making the most of present opportunities. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't mean you'll never experience difficulty, disappointment, or suffering. What changes is your relationship to these experiences. They become part of the human condition that you can meet with grace and wisdom, rather than catastrophes that threaten your sense of identity and well-being. You learn to surf the waves of life's ups and downs rather than being knocked over by them or spending all your energy trying to make the ocean calm. The Stoics understood that this kind of inner development is not just beneficial for the individual, but essential for creating healthy relationships and communities. When you're not constantly seeking validation from others, you're free to appreciate them for who they are, rather than what they can do for your ego. When you're not trying to control outcomes, you can collaborate more effectively because you're focused on contributing your best effort rather than manipulating results. When you're not reactive to criticism or conflict, you can engage in difficult conversations with curiosity and good faith rather than defensiveness and aggression. Perhaps most importantly, when you've developed genuine inner strength, you become capable of what the Stoics called sympathia, a deep recognition of your connection to all other human beings and your responsibility to contribute to the common good. This isn't a forced or artificial concern for others, but a natural outgrowth of the security that comes from not needing others to validate your worth or provide for your happiness. When your basic psychological needs are met from within, you're free to focus on how you can serve, contribute, and add value to the lives of others. This service orientation becomes one of the most fulfilling aspects of mature human development. Instead of constantly asking what you can get from life, you begin asking what you can give. Instead of focusing primarily on your own comfort and success, you start looking for ways to use your unique capabilities and resources to address real problems and create genuine value. This shift from taking to giving, from consuming to contributing, from seeking to serving, naturally generates the sense of purpose and meaning that most people spend their lives searching for in external achievements and acquisitions. The irony is that by letting go of the desperate pursuit of happiness, validation, and security, you often find that these experiences arise naturally as byproducts of living according to your values and contributing to something larger than your individual desires. Happiness becomes less about getting what you want and more about appreciating what you have and finding satisfaction in the process of growth and service. Validation becomes less important because you've learned to validate yourself through the integrity of your actions rather than through others' approval. Security becomes less about controlling external circumstances and more about trusting in your ability to adapt and respond wisely to whatever arises. This is the profound promise of Stoic philosophy. Not that life becomes easy or that you get everything you want, but that you develop the inner resources to meet whatever comes with strength, grace, and wisdom. You become someone who can be counted on by others because you can count on yourself. You become someone who adds stability to chaotic situations because you've learned to remain centered regardless of external turbulence. You become someone who can face uncertainty without anxiety because you've discovered that your well-being doesn't depend on being able to predict or control the future. The cultivation of these qualities requires patience with yourself and commitment to the process of growth rather than attachment to specific milestones or achievements. Like physical fitness, inner strength develops gradually through consistent practice rather than dramatic interventions. Some days will feel like major breakthroughs, others will feel like setbacks or plateaus. The key is to maintain your practice regardless of how you feel about your progress, trusting that the cumulative effect of small, consistent choices will eventually transform not just how you think about life, but how you experience it at the most fundamental level. This gradual transformation, through consistent practice, creates what we might call a new baseline for human experience, a fundamental shift in how you relate to the inevitable challenges and uncertainties that define mortal existence. Where once you might have experienced anxiety as your default response to the unknown, you begin to develop a capacity for what the Stoics called equanimity, a stable, balanced state of mind that can accommodate whatever arises without being destabilized by it. This doesn't mean becoming emotionally flat or indifferent to outcomes, but rather developing the emotional maturity to feel deeply while maintaining your center. The cultivation of equanimity reveals one of the most profound insights of ancient wisdom. Most of human suffering is optional. Not all of it, certainly. There are genuine losses, real physical pain, inevitable endings that cause legitimate grief. But the vast majority of our psychological suffering comes from our resistance to what is, our attachment to what we think should be, and our identification with thoughts and emotions that are essentially temporary weather patterns in the sky of consciousness. When you observe your own mind with the kind of gentle, persistent attention that Stoic practice develops, you begin to notice how much energy you spend fighting reality. You see how often you exhaust yourself trying to make other people behave the way you think they should. You recognize how frequently you cause yourself additional suffering by telling yourself stories about what certain events mean about your worth, your future, or your capabilities. You become aware of the countless ways you abandon the present moment, the only moment in which you actually have any power, to worry about futures that may never come, or replay past events that can't be changed. This growing awareness creates space for choice where once there was only automatic reaction. In that space, you can begin to practice what the Stoics called the art of living, the conscious cultivation of responses that align with wisdom rather than impulse, that serve your long-term flourishing rather than your immediate comfort, that contribute to the common good rather than just your individual preferences. This art isn't something you master once and then possess forever, but rather something you practice daily, moment by moment, choice by choice. The practice begins with learning to pause between stimulus and response, that crucial moment where freedom lives. When someone says something that triggers your anger, instead of immediately reacting with defensiveness or counterattack, you can create a small space of silence in which you consider what response would be most aligned with your values and most likely to produce a constructive outcome. When you face a setback or disappointment, instead of immediately spiraling into self-pity or blame, you can pause to consider what this situation might teach you, or how you might grow stronger through meeting it with grace. These pauses don't need to be long. Sometimes just a single conscious breath is enough to shift from reactive mode to responsive mode. But their cumulative effect is transformative. Each time you choose your response, rather than being unconsciously driven by your conditioning, you strengthen what we might call your responsibility, your capacity to respond consciously rather than react automatically. Over time, this conscious responding becomes more natural, more available in difficult moments, more integrated into your way of being in the world. The development of this capacity requires understanding the difference between what you think you need and what you actually need. Most people spend their lives pursuing things they believe are necessary for happiness and security: specific relationships, career achievements, material possessions, social recognition, perfect health, predictable circumstances. But when you examine these supposed needs closely, you often discover that they're actually preferences dressed up as requirements for well-being. The Stoic practice of examining your attachments doesn't mean giving up your goals or becoming indifferent to outcomes. It means learning to pursue what you value while holding the results lightly, recognizing that your fundamental well-being doesn't depend on getting any particular outcome. This shift from attachment to preference is liberating because it allows you to invest fully in your efforts while remaining emotionally stable, regardless of results. Consider how this might transform your approach to relationships. Instead of needing others to behave in certain ways for you to feel good about yourself, you can appreciate them for who they are, while taking responsibility for your own emotional state. Instead of trying to extract validation, security, or happiness from your connections with others, you can focus on what you have to contribute: your presence, your understanding, your support, your authentic self. This shift from taking to giving often paradoxically results in deeper, more satisfying relationships because you're no longer relating to others as instruments for meeting your psychological needs. The same principle applies to your work and creative endeavors. When you're attached to specific outcomes, particular levels of success, recognition, or financial reward, you often become so focused on results that you lose touch with the intrinsic satisfaction that comes from doing meaningful work well. But when you learn to find fulfillment in the process itself, in the growth that comes from taking on challenges, in the contribution you make regardless of how it's received, in the expression of your capabilities and values through your efforts, you discover a source of motivation that doesn't depend on external validation. This process orientation rather than outcome orientation naturally leads to what psychologists now call intrinsic motivation, the drive that comes from internal satisfaction rather than external rewards. Research consistently shows that people who are intrinsically motivated not only report higher levels of well-being and life satisfaction, but also tend to perform better and persist longer in pursuing their goals. The ancient Stoics understood this principle intuitively. When you find meaning in the quality of your efforts, rather than in the results those efforts produce, you become both happier and more effective. The cultivation of intrinsic motivation requires developing what we might call philosophical self-knowledge, understanding not just what you want, but why you want it, and whether pursuing it actually serves your deepest values and long-term flourishing. Many people spend years or even decades pursuing goals that they inherited from their family, absorbed from their culture, or adopted to gain approval from others, without ever examining whether these goals actually align with their authentic values and natural capabilities. This examination isn't always comfortable, because it often reveals the ways you've been living according to scripts written by others, rather than expressing your genuine self. You might discover that you've been pursuing a career path that looks impressive to others, but doesn't actually engage your natural interests or strengths. You might realize that you've been trying to maintain relationships that require you to suppress important aspects of yourself, to avoid conflict or rejection. You might recognize that you've been chasing achievements or experiences that provide temporary ego satisfaction, but don't contribute to your sense of meaning and purpose. But this discomfort is the beginning of authentic self-discovery. When you have the courage to examine your motivations honestly and align your life with your genuine values rather than inherited expectations, you often discover capabilities and interests that have been dormant for years. You find energy for pursuits that previously felt like obligations because they now feel like expressions of who you actually are, rather than performances designed to meet others' approval. This alignment between your actions and your authentic values creates what the Stoics called harmony, a sense of internal coherence where your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors are all pointing in the same direction. When you experience this harmony, you no longer feel fragmented or conflicted about your choices. You no longer exhaust yourself trying to maintain different personas for different situations. You no longer feel the chronic tension that comes from living according to values that don't actually reflect your deepest convictions. The experience of harmony is profoundly restful because it eliminates the internal friction that consumes so much of most people's energy. When your actions flow naturally from your values, when your goals reflect your authentic interests and capabilities, when your relationships allow you to be genuinely yourself, you discover reserves of energy and enthusiasm that you may not have felt since childhood. This isn't the manic energy that comes from external stimulation or the desperate energy that comes from trying to prove something, but the sustainable energy that comes from living in alignment with your true nature. This sustainable energy becomes the foundation for what might be called effortless effort, a way of engaging with challenges and goals that feels more like play than work, more like expression than striving. When you're operating from this place of alignment and intrinsic motivation, obstacles become interesting puzzles rather than sources of frustration. Setbacks become opportunities for learning and growth rather than evidence of your inadequacy. Uncertainty becomes space for creativity and discovery rather than a source of anxiety about what might go wrong. The Stoics understood that this effortless effort is only possible when you've learned to work with reality rather than against it, to flow with circumstances, rather than rigidly insisting that they conform to your preferences. This doesn't mean becoming passive or accepting harmful situations without trying to change them. It means developing the wisdom to distinguish between what can be changed and what must be accepted, and the skill to respond appropriately to both types of situations. When you encounter something that genuinely needs to be changed and is within your power to influence, you can act decisively and persistently without being attached to achieving change within a specific time frame or in a specific way. When you encounter something that cannot be changed or is outside your sphere of influence, you can accept it gracefully without wasting energy on futile resistance or falling into victimhood and resentment. This discrimination between what can and cannot be changed requires developing what we might call practical wisdom, the ability to assess situations accurately and respond appropriately rather than simply reacting based on your preferences or conditioning. Practical wisdom involves understanding not just what you want to happen, but what's actually possible given current circumstances, what actions are likely to be effective, and what unintended consequences your interventions might create. The development of practical wisdom comes through experience, reflection, and the willingness to learn from both successes and failures without becoming attached to either as defining your worth or capabilities. When you approach life as a student rather than as someone who already knows everything, every situation becomes a teacher. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to deepen your understanding of how to live skillfully and contribute meaningfully to the world. This student mindset creates a fundamental shift in how you relate to the inevitable mistakes, setbacks, and failures that are part of any meaningful life. Instead of viewing these experiences as evidence of your inadequacy or as reasons to give up on your goals, you begin to see them as tuition payments in the university of experience, sometimes expensive, often uncomfortable, but always potentially valuable if you're willing to learn from them rather than simply suffer through them. The Stoics understood that this reframing of difficult experiences isn't about toxic positivity or pretending that painful situations are actually wonderful opportunities in disguise. Pain is pain, loss is loss. Failure can be genuinely disappointing, and costly. But the meaning you make from these experiences, the story you tell yourself about what they mean about you and your future, and the choices you make in response to them, these remain entirely within your control, regardless of what has happened to you. This distinction between what happens to you and how you respond to what happens to you becomes the foundation for developing what we might call anti-fragility, the capacity not just to survive difficult experiences, but to become stronger through meeting them with wisdom and grace. Most people approach challenges with the goal of getting through them with minimal damage, like trying to weather a storm by finding shelter and waiting for it to pass. But the Stoic approach is more like learning to dance in the rain, finding ways to remain engaged, creative, and even joyful in the midst of difficult circumstances. This doesn't mean being reckless or seeking out unnecessary hardship, but rather developing the confidence that comes from knowing you can handle whatever life presents. When you've practiced responding to smaller challenges with equanimity and wisdom, you build a track record of resilience that gives you confidence in facing larger difficulties. You begin to trust not that life will be easy, but that you have the inner resources to meet whatever comes with grace and strength. This trust in your own resilience eliminates one of the major sources of chronic anxiety, the fear that you won't be able to handle future challenges. Most anxiety isn't actually about present circumstances, but about imagined future difficulties that may never materialize. When you know from experience that you can adapt, learn, and grow through adversity, the unknown future becomes less threatening and more interesting. Uncertainty transforms from a source of fear into a space of possibility. The cultivation of this confidence requires what the Stoics called negative visualization, the practice of mentally rehearsing potential losses or setbacks not to create anxiety, but to reduce your attachment to specific outcomes and increase your confidence in your ability to handle whatever might happen. This isn't about dwelling on worst-case scenarios or becoming pessimistic about life, but rather about building emotional resilience through mental preparation. When you occasionally imagine losing something you value, a relationship, a job, your health, your possessions, and contemplate how you might respond with dignity and wisdom, you accomplish several important things. First, you reduce the power these potential losses have to control your behavior through fear. Second, you increase your appreciation for what you currently have by recognizing that nothing is permanent or guaranteed. Third, you build confidence in your ability to maintain your essential well-being even if external circumstances change dramatically. This practice reveals one of the most liberating insights of Stoic philosophy. Your fundamental worth and capacity for contentment don't depend on maintaining any particular set of external circumstances. You are not your job, your relationship status, your bank account, your health condition, your social position, or any other external factor that might change. You are the consciousness that experiences all these things, the awareness that can observe thoughts and emotions without being defined by them, the capacity for choice that remains available regardless of what's happening around you. This recognition of your essential invulnerability creates space for what the Stoics called magnanimity, a generous, big-hearted approach to life that comes from knowing you have enough inner resources to share freely without depleting yourself. When you're not constantly worried about protecting your ego or securing your position, you become free to contribute to others' well-being without calculation or expectation of return. When you're not attached to specific outcomes, you can invest wholeheartedly in meaningful projects without being devastated if they don't succeed exactly as planned. Magnanimity naturally expresses itself as what we might call intelligent compassion, the ability to respond to others' suffering and your own with both tenderness and wisdom. This isn't the sentimental compassion that tries to eliminate all discomfort, or the enabling compassion that rescues others from the natural consequences of their choices. It's the mature compassion that recognizes that some suffering is inevitable and potentially growthful, while other suffering is unnecessary and can be alleviated through wise action. This intelligent compassion begins with your relationship to yourself. Instead of treating yourself harshly when you make mistakes or fall short of your ideals, you learn to respond to your own imperfections with the same patience and encouragement you would offer a good friend who was struggling. Instead of demanding perfection from yourself, you accept that growth is a gradual process that includes setbacks and plateaus, as well as breakthroughs and progress. This self-compassion isn't self-indulgence or lowering your standards. It's recognizing that harsh self-criticism rarely leads to sustainable improvement, while patient self-acceptance creates the psychological safety necessary for genuine learning and growth. When you're not constantly defending yourself against your own inner critic, you have more energy available for actually working on areas where you want to develop and improve. The practice of self-compassion gradually extends outward to encompass your relationships with others. When you stop being so harsh with yourself, you naturally become less judgmental of others' imperfections and struggles. When you accept your own humanity, you become more patient with others' humanity. When you give yourself permission to be a work in progress, you become more supportive of others who are also learning and growing, rather than expecting them to be finished products who never disappoint you. This shift from judgment to understanding transforms the quality of your relationships in profound ways. Instead of relating to others primarily as sources of validation, entertainment, or practical support, you begin to see them as fellow travelers on the journey of human development, each dealing with their own challenges, fears, and aspirations as best they know how. This perspective naturally generates empathy and reduces the interpersonal friction that comes from constantly expecting others to meet your needs or live up to your standards. The development of this more mature approach to relationships requires understanding the difference between boundaries and walls. Boundaries are conscious choices about how you want to engage with others based on your values and what you believe serves everyone's highest good. Walls are defensive reactions based on fear, past hurt, or the desire to control others' behavior. Boundaries are flexible and context-dependent. Walls are rigid and indiscriminate. Boundaries enhance intimacy by creating safety. Walls prevent intimacy by creating distance. When you've developed genuine inner strength and self-compassion, you can maintain appropriate boundaries without building walls. You can say no to requests that don't align with your values or available resources without feeling guilty or needing to justify your decisions extensively. You can address problems in relationships directly and kindly without becoming defensive or aggressive. You can allow others to experience the natural consequences of their choices without feeling responsible for rescuing them or making them comfortable. This capacity for healthy boundaries paradoxically allows for greater intimacy and vulnerability in your close relationships. When you're not constantly trying to manage others' emotions or avoid their disapproval, you can be more authentically yourself in their presence. When you're not depending on their approval for your sense of worth, you can share your genuine thoughts and feelings without fear of rejection. When you trust in your ability to handle whatever responses you receive, you can take the emotional risks that deep connection requires. The Stoics understood that this kind of mature love that comes from fullness rather than neediness, that seeks to contribute rather than extract, that accepts others as they are while encouraging their growth, is one of the highest expressions of human development. It's love that enhances both people's freedom rather than diminishing it, that supports both people's authenticity rather than requiring performance, that creates space for both people to become their best selves rather than demanding that they remain static to maintain the relationship's comfort. This evolution in your capacity for relationship naturally extends to your relationship with life itself. Instead of approaching existence as something that should provide you with happiness, security, and satisfaction, you begin to ask what you can contribute to the great human conversation, how you can use your unique gifts and circumstances to add value to the world, what legacy of wisdom and kindness you can leave through your daily choices and interactions. This shift from taking to giving, from demanding to offering, from consuming to creating, naturally generates the sense of meaning and purpose that most people spend their lives seeking in external achievements and acquisitions. When your life becomes an expression of your deepest values and highest capabilities, rather than a strategy for meeting your psychological needs, you discover a source of fulfillment that doesn't depend on circumstances aligning in any particular way. The recognition that meaning comes through contribution rather than consumption leads to what we might call the service orientation, a natural inclination to use your time, energy, and resources in ways that benefit not just yourself, but the larger communities and systems of which you're a part. This isn't forced altruism or guilt-driven do-gooding, but the spontaneous expression of a person who has found their own center and naturally wants to share what they've discovered. This service orientation often manifests in unexpected ways. You might find yourself naturally becoming a more patient presence in difficult situations because you're no longer reactive to conflict or stress. You might discover that your approach to work becomes less about advancing your career and more about doing excellent work that genuinely serves the people who benefit from it. You might notice that your conversations with others become more about understanding and supporting them rather than proving your intelligence or getting them to validate your perspectives. These subtle but profound shifts in how you show up in daily life create ripple effects that extend far beyond your immediate experience. When you're no longer consumed by your own psychological needs and defensive reactions, you become available to notice and respond to the needs of others in ways that feel natural rather than obligatory. You begin to see opportunities for kindness, support, and constructive contribution that were previously invisible because your attention was focused inward on protecting your ego or managing your anxiety about how others perceived you. This expanded awareness reveals one of the most beautiful aspects of mature human development: the recognition that individual flourishing and collective well-being are not competing interests, but complementary expressions of the same underlying wisdom. When you've learned to generate your own sense of worth, security, and contentment from within, you naturally want to create conditions that support others in developing these same capacities. Your personal liberation becomes a gift you offer to everyone whose life you touch. The Stoics called this recognition sympathia, the understanding that all human beings are connected in a fundamental web of interdependence, and that what serves the genuine good of one ultimately serves the good of all. This isn't sentimental idealism, but practical wisdom. When people around you are operating from inner strength rather than inner neediness, when they're responding from wisdom rather than reacting from fear, when they're contributing from fullness rather than taking from emptiness, your own life becomes easier and more fulfilling as well. This understanding naturally leads to what we might call ethical leadership, the capacity to influence others through example rather than manipulation, to create positive change through embodying the qualities you want to see in the world rather than trying to force others to behave differently. This kind of leadership doesn't require formal authority or special position. It's available to anyone who has done the inner work necessary to become a stable, trustworthy presence in whatever situations they find themselves. Ethical leadership begins with what the Stoics called integrity, the alignment between your values, your words, and your actions. When these three elements are consistently in harmony, you develop what we might call moral authority, the kind of influence that comes from living according to principles that others can see are genuinely serving your own flourishing and contributing to the common good. People are naturally drawn to this kind of authentic strength because it represents what they sense is possible for themselves. The development of integrity requires ongoing honest self-examination, the willingness to look at the ways your actual behavior might not align with your stated values, and the courage to make changes where necessary. This isn't about achieving perfection, but about developing the habit of course correction when you notice yourself acting in ways that don't reflect your deepest convictions. It's about becoming someone whose word can be trusted because you've learned to be honest with yourself about your own motivations and capabilities. This self-honesty extends to acknowledging both your strengths and your limitations without false modesty or grandiose self-importance. You develop what might be called realistic self-assessment, the capacity to see yourself clearly without the distortions that come from either self-deprecation or self-aggrandizement. This clear self-perception creates space for what the Stoics considered one of the highest human capacities, the ability to change and grow throughout your entire life. When you're not defending a fixed image of yourself, when you're not trying to prove that you already know everything you need to know, When you're not afraid of appearing imperfect or incompetent, you become infinitely teachable. Every experience becomes a potential source of wisdom. Every person you meet becomes a potential teacher. Every challenge becomes an opportunity for development. This teachability doesn't mean becoming wishy-washy or abandoning your principles every time you encounter a new perspective. It means holding your current understanding lightly enough to remain open to new information, while still having enough conviction in your values to act decisively when action is required. It's the balance between intellectual humility and practical confidence that allows you to keep learning while still being able to function effectively in the world. The cultivation of this balance requires developing what we might call philosophical flexibility, the ability to adapt your strategies and tactics while maintaining your core principles, to adjust your methods while staying true to your fundamental values. This flexibility becomes especially important when you're working to create positive change in complex systems or relationships where rigid approaches often create resistance and unintended consequences. For example, if one of your core values is honesty, philosophical flexibility means finding ways to communicate truthfully that are also skillful and compassionate, recognizing that brutal honesty without wisdom and timing can sometimes cause more harm than good. If you value justice, flexibility means understanding that achieving fair outcomes sometimes requires working within imperfect systems, while also working to improve those systems over time. If you value courage, flexibility means recognizing that sometimes courage looks like speaking up, and sometimes it looks like patient endurance. This nuanced approach to living your values requires developing what the Stoics called practical wisdom, the ability to discern what response is most appropriate in each unique situation. Practical wisdom can't be learned from books alone or developed through abstract thinking. It emerges through the accumulated experience of trying to apply universal principles in particular circumstances, learning from both successes and failures, and gradually developing better judgment about how to be helpful rather than just correct. The development of practical wisdom naturally leads to what we might call contextual sensitivity, the ability to read situations accurately and respond appropriately, rather than applying one-size-fits-all solutions to complex human problems. You learn to recognize when someone needs encouragement versus when they need honest feedback, when a situation calls for decisive action versus when it requires patient waiting, when it's appropriate to be direct versus when subtlety and diplomacy serve better. This sensitivity extends to your relationship with time itself. Instead of living in a constant state of urgency, trying to force results according to your preferred timeline, you develop an appreciation for natural rhythms and organic development. You learn to plant seeds without demanding immediate harvest, to work persistently toward long-term goals without becoming impatient with the pace of progress, to invest in relationships and projects that may not show results for years, but align with your deepest values and vision for your life. This patient approach to change and growth creates space for what might be called sustainable transformation, changes that last because they emerge from genuine understanding and inner development rather than willpower and external pressure. Instead of making dramatic resolutions that you can't maintain, you focus on small, consistent adjustments that gradually reshape your habits and patterns. Instead of trying to become a completely different person overnight, you work on becoming a slightly better version of yourself each day. The Stoics understood that this gradual approach to development is not only more sustainable, but also more respectful of the natural process by which human beings actually change and grow. Lasting transformation happens at the level of identity and worldview, not just behavior and circumstances. When you focus on becoming the kind of person who naturally acts in accordance with your values, rather than just trying to force yourself to behave differently, the changes you make tend to stick because they flow from who you've become rather than what you're trying to do. This identity-based approach to change requires patience with the process of becoming. You have to be willing to exist in the uncomfortable space between who you've been and who you're becoming, to tolerate the uncertainty that comes with growth, to maintain faith in your capacity for transformation even when progress feels slow or invisible. This requires developing what we might call developmental faith, the confidence that if you keep showing up and doing the work, you will continue to grow and evolve throughout your life. This faith isn't based on wishful thinking, but on the accumulated evidence of your capacity for learning and adaptation. Every time you faced a challenge that initially seemed beyond your capabilities and found a way to meet it, every time you've broken through a limiting belief or pattern that once seemed permanent, every time you've developed a new skill or deepened an existing capacity, you've proven to yourself that growth is not only possible, but inevitable when you commit to it consistently. The recognition of your own capacity for continued development creates what we might call generative optimism, a hopeful outlook that's based not on the expectation that life will be easy or that everything will work out exactly as you want, but on the confidence that you can continue learning, growing, and adapting regardless of what circumstances arise. This optimism doesn't deny the reality of suffering, loss, or failure, but it maintains that these experiences can contribute to your development if you're willing to learn from them, rather than simply be defeated by them. This generative optimism naturally extends to your view of other people's potential as well. When you've experienced your own capacity for transformation, you become more patient with others who are struggling with patterns and limitations that you've worked through yourself. You're more likely to see their current difficulties as temporary stages in their development rather than permanent features of their character. You become more willing to invest in relationships and collaborations that may require time to mature and bear fruit. This expanded perspective on human potential creates opportunities for what we might call transformational relationships, connections with others that support mutual growth and development rather than just comfort, entertainment. These relationships are characterized by honest communication, mutual encouragement of each other's highest aspirations, willingness to address problems directly and constructively, and commitment to each other's long-term flourishing rather than just immediate pleasure or convenience. The cultivation of transformational relationships creates a positive feedback loop that accelerates your personal development while contributing to the growth and well-being of those around you. When you surround yourself with people who are committed to their own inner development, who value honesty over comfort, who support your highest aspirations rather than enabling your limitations, you create an environment that naturally calls forth your best self. These relationships become laboratories for practicing the virtues you're developing: patience when others are struggling, courage when difficult conversations are needed, wisdom when guidance is sought, justice when fairness is required. This kind of relational environment stands in stark contrast to the more common pattern of relationships based primarily on mutual validation, shared complaints, or comfortable familiarity that doesn't challenge anyone to grow. While there's nothing wrong with enjoying pleasant company or seeking comfort from others during difficult times, relationships that revolve primarily around these functions often inadvertently reinforce patterns of dependency, victimhood, or stagnation that keep everyone involved operating below their potential. The difference lies in what you're fundamentally seeking from your connections with others. When you approach relationships primarily as sources of validation, entertainment, or emotional regulation, you unconsciously pressure others to meet your psychological needs and often feel disappointed when they fail to do so consistently. But when you approach relationships as opportunities for mutual support in the great work of human development, you create space for both authentic connection and individual growth. This shift requires developing what we might call relational maturity, the capacity to appreciate others for who they are, while simultaneously supporting their potential for who they might become. This maturity recognizes that genuine love sometimes requires saying difficult things, that real friendship sometimes involves allowing others to experience the natural consequences of their choices rather than rescuing them, that authentic intimacy sometimes requires sharing your honest perceptions, even when they might be uncomfortable to hear. The practice of relational maturity begins with learning to distinguish between helping and enabling, between supporting and codepending, between caring and caretaking. Helping involves offering resources, perspective, or assistance that genuinely serves another person's capacity to handle their own life more effectively. Enabling involves taking on responsibilities that properly belong to others, or protecting them from experiences that might actually contribute to their growth and learning. This distinction becomes especially important when dealing with people who are struggling with challenges that trigger your own desire to fix, rescue, or control outcomes. The impulse to help others avoid pain or solve their problems for them often comes from a genuine place of caring, but it can inadvertently rob them of opportunities to develop their own resilience, problem-solving skills, and confidence in their ability to handle difficulties. The Stoic approach to relationships recognizes that each person has their own journey of development that cannot be shortcut or accomplished by someone else, no matter how much that person cares about their well-being. You can offer support, perspective, resources, and encouragement, but the actual work of growth and change must be done by each individual. This recognition paradoxically allows for deeper intimacy, because it releases you from the impossible burden of trying to manage others' lives and frees you to appreciate their unique path of development. This appreciation for individual autonomy within relationship creates space for what we might call empowering love. Love that enhances rather than diminishes each person's capacity for self-direction, that encourages rather than controls, that trusts rather than manages. This kind of love requires tremendous faith in others' capacity for growth and wisdom, even when they're currently making choices you wouldn't make, or going through experiences you wish they could avoid. The cultivation of empowering love begins with examining your own motivations in relationships. Are you trying to get your needs met? Or are you focused on contributing to the other person's well-being? Are you attached to specific outcomes for their life? Or can you support their journey even when it takes directions you wouldn't choose? Are you trying to change them into someone who meets your preferences? Or can you appreciate who they are while encouraging their authentic development? These questions aren't meant to eliminate caring or investment in others' lives, but rather to purify your caring so that it serves their genuine good rather than your psychological needs. When your love for others is free from agenda and attachment, it becomes a powerful force for their empowerment and growth. People can feel the difference between being loved for what you can get from them and being loved for who they are and who they're becoming. This quality of love naturally extends beyond your intimate relationships to encompass your broader interactions with colleagues, acquaintances, and even strangers. When you've learned to see others as fellow travelers on the path of human development rather than as instruments for meeting your needs or obstacles to your preferences, you begin to relate to everyone with greater patience, curiosity, and goodwill. This expanded circle of care doesn't mean treating everyone with the same level of intimacy or involvement that you have with close friends and family members. It means bringing the same fundamental respect for human dignity and potential to all your interactions, regardless of the specific role someone plays in your life. You can maintain appropriate boundaries and different levels of engagement while still approaching everyone from a place of basic goodwill and recognition of their inherent worth. This universal benevolence, as the Stoics called it, creates a quality of presence that tends to bring out the best in others. When people sense that you see them as more than just their current limitations or mistakes, when they feel that you have faith in their capacity for growth and wisdom, they often rise to meet that higher vision of themselves. Your belief in others' potential becomes a gift that empowers them to access capabilities they may not have known they possessed. The practice of universal benevolence requires developing what we might call generous interpretation, the habit of assuming the best about others' motivations and giving them the benefit of the doubt when their behavior seems problematic or confusing. This doesn't mean being naive about people's capacity for harmful behavior or failing to protect yourself when necessary. It means starting from the assumption that most people are doing the best they know how to do, given their current level of understanding and the circumstances they're facing. This generous interpretation often reveals information and possibilities that judgmental interpretation obscures. When you assume that someone's difficult behavior stems from pain, fear, confusion, or lack of skill rather than malicious intent, you're more likely to respond in ways that address the underlying causes rather than simply reacting to the surface symptoms. This approach often leads to more effective problem-solving and relationship repair than defensive or punitive responses. The development of generous interpretation requires practicing what we might call psychological spaciousness, the capacity to remain curious and open-hearted, even when others' behavior triggers your own defensive reactions or emotional wounds. This spaciousness isn't created by suppressing your feelings or pretending that others' actions don't affect you, but rather by developing a larger sense of identity that can contain your emotional responses without being overwhelmed by them. This larger identity is rooted in your growing connection to what the Stoics called the logos, the underlying rational principle that governs the universe and connects all things in a web of meaningful relationship. From this perspective, the difficulties and conflicts that arise in human relationships aren't random annoyances or personal attacks, but rather opportunities to practice wisdom, develop patience, and contribute to the overall harmony of the systems you're part of. This cosmic perspective doesn't diminish the importance of individual relationships or make personal conflicts seem trivial. Instead, it provides a larger context that helps you respond to relationship challenges from a place of wisdom rather than reactivity. When you can see interpersonal difficulties as part of the larger process by which human beings learn to live together more skillfully, you're more likely to respond in ways that serve the long-term good of everyone involved, rather than just your immediate comfort or preferences. The cultivation of this cosmic perspective requires regularly stepping back from the immediate details of your personal life to consider the larger patterns and purposes that your experiences might serve. This isn't about detaching from life or becoming indifferent to outcomes, but rather about maintaining awareness of the bigger picture that gives meaning and direction to your daily choices and interactions. This broader awareness naturally leads to what we might call purposeful living, organizing your time, energy, and resources around contributions that serve something larger than your individual desires and comfort. This purpose doesn't need to be grandiose or world-changing. It simply needs to be meaningful to you and genuinely beneficial to others. It might involve being an excellent parent, creating beautiful art, building a business that provides valuable services, teaching skills that help others flourish, or simply being a reliable, positive presence in your community. The key is that your sense of purpose emerges from your authentic values and natural capabilities rather than from external expectations or the desire to impress others. When your life is organized around purposes that genuinely align with who you are and what you care about, work becomes expression rather than drudgery. Challenges become opportunities for growth rather than threats to your security, and relationships become collaborations in service of shared values rather than competitions for limited resources. This alignment between your daily activities and your deeper purposes creates what might be called existential satisfaction, a sense that your life matters, that your efforts contribute to something worthwhile, that your existence has meaning beyond just your personal pleasure and comfort. This satisfaction doesn't depend on achieving specific results or receiving recognition from others. It comes from the intrinsic fulfillment of living in accordance with your highest values and using your capabilities in service of what you believe is genuinely important. The development of existential satisfaction requires ongoing reflection on what you actually find meaningful versus what you think you should find meaningful based on social conditioning or family expectations. Many people spend years pursuing goals that look impressive from the outside, but don't actually engage their authentic interests or utilize their natural strengths. This misalignment between external achievement and internal fulfillment often leads to what psychologists call the success depression, a sense of emptiness that can occur even when you've accomplished everything you thought you wanted. The Stoic path offers an alternative, defining success in terms of character development and meaningful contribution, rather than external achievement and social recognition. From this perspective, a life well lived is one in which you consistently chose wisdom over convenience, courage over comfort, justice over self-interest, and moderation over excess. Regardless of what specific outcomes these choices produced, this redefinition of success creates a profound liberation from the anxiety and frustration that characterize so much of modern life. When your sense of accomplishment depends on factors within your control, the quality of your character, the integrity of your choices, the wisdom with which you respond to challenges, you discover a source of satisfaction that remains stable regardless of external circumstances. You no longer need to wait for other people's approval, favorable market conditions, or perfect timing to feel that your efforts are worthwhile. The worthiness emerges from the excellence of the effort itself, not from the results it produces. This shift fundamentally alters your relationship with what the Stoics called preferred indifference, outcomes that you naturally prefer but don't need for your fundamental well-being. Health is preferable to sickness, prosperity to poverty, recognition to obscurity, but your happiness and sense of purpose don't depend on maintaining any particular state in these areas. You can work toward your preferred outcomes while remaining emotionally stable, whether you achieve them or not. This emotional stability in the face of uncertainty creates space for what we might call strategic patience, the ability to persist in meaningful work over long periods without becoming discouraged by temporary setbacks or slow progress. Most people abandon worthwhile projects prematurely because they become discouraged when results don't come quickly enough or easily enough. But when you understand that the value of your efforts lies in the character they develop and the contribution they make, rather than in the immediate rewards they generate, you become capable of the kind of sustained effort that eventually produces substantial results. This capacity for sustained effort becomes especially important when you're working on challenges that matter deeply to you, but extend beyond your individual control, improving relationships, creating positive change in organizations, contributing to social causes, developing artistic or intellectual work that may not be appreciated immediately. These endeavors require what we might call faith in the process, the confidence that consistent, high-quality effort in alignment with your values will ultimately bear fruit, even if you can't predict exactly when or how. This faith isn't based on wishful thinking or guaranteed outcomes, but rather on the recognition that when you consistently act according to wisdom and virtue, you set in motion patterns and influences that tend to create positive results over time. You may not be able to control exactly what those results will be or when they will manifest, but you can trust that your efforts contribute to the overall movement toward greater wisdom, justice, and flourishing in whatever systems you're part of. The cultivation of this trust in the process requires developing what the Stoics called cosmic consciousness, an awareness of your place within the larger patterns and purposes that govern existence. This consciousness recognizes that individual lives are meaningful not in isolation, but as part of the ongoing evolution of human understanding and capability. Your personal growth contributes to the collective wisdom of humanity. Your relationships become laboratories for developing better ways of living together. Your work becomes part of the great human project of creating conditions that support everyone's flourishing. This cosmic perspective doesn't diminish the importance of your individual choices and experiences, but rather places them within a context that gives them deeper meaning and significance. Every moment in which you choose wisdom over reactivity, every interaction in which you respond with compassion rather than judgment, every decision in which you prioritize long-term good over immediate gratification contributes to the gradual improvement of human consciousness and capability. This understanding naturally leads to what we might call legacy thinking, considering how your daily choices contribute to the kind of world you're helping to create for future generations. This doesn't require grand gestures or world-changing achievements. It simply involves recognizing that your example, your relationships, your work, and your way of being all influence others in ways that ripple outward far beyond what you can directly observe. The parent who consistently models emotional regulation and thoughtful decision-making provides their children with resources for handling their own challenges throughout their lives. The colleague who remains calm and constructive during workplace conflicts demonstrates possibilities that others may adopt in their own professional relationships. The friend who listens with genuine curiosity rather than rushing to give advice creates space for others to develop their own wisdom and self-trust. These seemingly ordinary expressions of character and wisdom become extraordinary when you consider their cumulative effect over time and their influence on all the people whose lives they touch. The Stoics understood that this kind of positive influence through example is one of the most powerful ways to create beneficial change in the world, because it doesn't require forcing others to behave differently, but rather inspires them to want to develop similar capacities in themselves. This inspirational approach to influence requires cultivating what we might call magnetic authenticity, a quality of genuineness that naturally attracts others because it represents what they sense is possible for themselves. This magnetism doesn't come from trying to impress anyone or from performing a role designed to gain approval, but rather from the simple power of someone living fully from their authentic values and natural capabilities. People are drawn to this kind of authenticity because it gives them permission to be genuine themselves. When you're no longer performing or pretending, when you're not trying to manage others' impressions of you, when you're simply showing up as who you actually are while continuously working to become your best self, you create space for others to drop their own masks and defenses. This mutual authenticity creates possibilities for connection, collaboration, and mutual support that aren't available when everyone is primarily focused on image management and impression control. The development of magnetic authenticity requires ongoing commitment to what we might call radical honesty, not the aggressive truth-telling that sometimes masquerades as authenticity, but the gentle, persistent commitment to aligning your outer expression with your inner reality. This involves acknowledging your limitations and mistakes without self-condemnation, sharing your genuine thoughts and feelings without demanding that others validate them, and expressing your values through your actions rather than just your words. This radical honesty extends to your relationship with your own development process. Instead of pretending to have achieved some state of perfect wisdom or emotional stability, you can acknowledge that you're a work in progress who sometimes falls back into old patterns of reactivity or limitation. This acknowledgement doesn't undermine your credibility or authority. It actually enhances it by demonstrating that growth is an ongoing process rather than a destination you reach and then maintain effortlessly. The willingness to be seen as imperfect and still growing creates what we might call developmental transparency, the capacity to let others witness your process of learning and change rather than only showing them your polished achievements. This transparency becomes a gift to others because it normalizes the struggles and setbacks that are natural parts of any meaningful development journey. It shows them that they don't need to wait until they're perfect to begin contributing meaningfully to the world or to deserve love and respect from others. This developmental transparency also creates opportunities for mutual learning and support that aren't possible when everyone is trying to appear as if they've already figured everything out. When you can acknowledge areas where you're still learning and growing, you become able to receive feedback, guidance, and support from others without feeling that your competence or worth is being questioned. You can collaborate more effectively because you're focused on achieving good outcomes rather than protecting your image. The practice of developmental transparency requires distinguishing between vulnerability and oversharing, between honest self-disclosure and using others as unpaid therapists. Healthy transparency involves sharing your authentic experience in ways that contribute to mutual understanding and connection, while maintaining appropriate boundaries about what's your responsibility to process internally versus what's appropriate to share with others. This balance between openness and discretion develops naturally when your primary motivation is contributing to others' well-being rather than getting your own emotional needs met through the sharing. When you're sharing your experience to help others feel less alone in their own struggles, or to demonstrate that growth is possible despite challenges, the sharing tends to feel supportive and inspiring. When you're sharing primarily to receive comfort, validation, or advice for problems you need to work through yourself, the sharing often feels burdensome or manipulative to others. The key is developing what we might call discerning authenticity, the wisdom to know when, how, and with whom to share different aspects of your inner experience. This discernment recognizes that different relationships can support different levels and types of sharing, that timing matters in when certain topics are introduced, and that authentic sharing serves connection rather than demanding it. This sophisticated understanding of authentic relationship creates space for what the Stoics called true friendship, connections based on mutual respect for each other's character and commitment to each other's flourishing rather than just compatibility, entertainment, or mutual need meeting. True friendship in this sense can exist between people who have very different personalities, interests, or life circumstances because it's based on recognizing and appreciating the virtue and wisdom in another person rather than on surface similarities or complementary neuroses. These friendships become sources of both challenge and support, relationships that encourage your best self while accepting your current limitations, that offer honest feedback when you're operating below your potential, while maintaining faith in your capacity for growth. They're relationships in which you can be genuinely yourself while also being inspired to become more than you currently are. The cultivation of true friendship requires developing what we might call appreciative perception, the ability to see and acknowledge the good qualities in others even when they're struggling with limitations or going through difficult periods. This doesn't mean ignoring problems or pretending that everything is fine when it's not, but rather maintaining awareness of people's fundamental goodness and potential, even when their current behavior doesn't reflect their highest capacities. This appreciative perception creates a positive feedback loop in relationships where people tend to live up to the best vision of themselves that others hold for them. When you consistently see and acknowledge others' strengths, wisdom, and potential, you help them access these qualities more readily. Your faith in their goodness becomes a mirror that helps them see themselves more clearly and compassionately. This mirroring effect reveals one of the most profound ways that individual transformation contributes to collective elevation. As you develop genuine inner strength and emotional maturity, you become a source of stability and encouragement that helps others access their own dormant capacities for wisdom and resilience. Your example demonstrates that it's possible to remain calm in chaotic situations, to respond with thoughtfulness rather than reactivity, to maintain hope and purpose even during difficult periods. This demonstration doesn't require any explicit teaching or preaching. It simply shows what human beings are capable of when they commit to developing their character rather than just managing their circumstances. The ripple effects of this kind of positive modeling extend far beyond your immediate relationships. The colleague who witnesses your grace under pressure may develop more confidence in handling their own workplace challenges. The stranger who observes your patience with a difficult person may be inspired to respond more thoughtfully in their own encounters with frustrating behavior. The family member who sees how you handle disappointment without falling into bitterness may learn new possibilities for their own emotional regulation. These influences operate below the level of conscious awareness much of the time. People absorb examples of how to be human from everyone they encounter, and your way of showing up in the world becomes part of the collective repository of possibilities that others draw from when facing their own challenges. This is why the Stoics placed such emphasis on living according to virtue, regardless of whether anyone was watching or acknowledging your efforts. They understood that every moment of choosing wisdom over reactivity, courage over avoidance, or compassion over judgment contributes to the overall improvement of human consciousness. This recognition of your subtle but continuous influence on others naturally leads to what we might call conscious modeling, deliberately choosing to embody the qualities you want to see more of in the world. This doesn't mean performing or pretending to be someone you're not, but rather consistently choosing to express your highest capacities even when it would be easier to operate from habit, emotion, or convenience. Conscious modeling becomes especially important during challenging times when others around you may be struggling with fear, anger, or despair. In these situations, your capacity to remain centered and constructive becomes a beacon of possibility for those who are feeling overwhelmed by circumstances. Your example reminds them that it's possible to maintain inner stability even when external conditions are chaotic or threatening. The development of this steadying influence requires cultivating what the Stoics called magnanimity, a greatness of soul that expresses itself through consistent dignity, generosity, and strength of character. Magnanimity isn't about being superior to others or feeling proud of your achievements, but rather about operating from a sense of abundance and capability that allows you to contribute to others' well-being without depleting yourself. This magnanimous approach to life naturally expresses itself through what we might call quiet leadership, the kind of influence that comes from consistently doing excellent work, treating others with respect and kindness, and maintaining high standards for yourself without imposing those standards judgmentally on others. This leadership doesn't require formal authority or public recognition. It emerges naturally when people recognize the authenticity and stability of your character. The practice of quiet leadership involves learning to influence through attraction rather than persuasion, through example rather than argument, through service rather than self-promotion. When you embody the qualities you believe are important, integrity, wisdom, courage, compassion, you create an energetic field that tends to elevate everyone around you. People feel better about themselves and more optimistic about possibilities when they're in the presence of someone who is genuinely living according to their highest values. This elevating influence becomes particularly powerful because it's offered without agenda or expectation of return. You're not trying to change others or get them to behave in certain ways. You're simply being the best version of yourself and allowing that example to speak for itself. This non-manipulative approach to influence creates space for others to grow and change at their own pace and in their own way, rather than feeling pressured to conform to your expectations or timeline. The freedom you offer others to be themselves while you model alternatives creates what we might call generative tension, the productive discomfort that can motivate growth when people recognize the gap between their current way of operating and what they sense might be possible for them. This tension isn't created by criticism or judgment, but simply by the contrast between different approaches to living. When people see someone handling challenges with grace that they typically handle with stress, or responding to conflict with curiosity that they usually meet with defensiveness, they may begin to wonder if there might be better ways to navigate their own experiences. This wondering is the beginning of voluntary transformation, change that emerges from internal motivation rather than external pressure. The most sustainable and profound changes in human behavior come not from being told what to do or forced to behave differently, but from recognizing possibilities that genuinely appeal to us and choosing to develop the capabilities necessary to embody those possibilities. Your role in facilitating this kind of voluntary transformation is simply to live in such a way that people can see what becomes possible when someone commits to developing their character and aligning their actions with their deepest values. You become a living example of the benefits of choosing wisdom over convenience, courage over comfort, and contribution over consumption. This example plants seeds that may take months or years to sprout, but when they do, the growth that emerges is genuine and lasting, because it comes from the person's own recognition of what serves their authentic well-being. The patience required for this kind of long-term influence reflects a fundamental shift from outcome-oriented to process-oriented living. Instead of trying to achieve specific results by specific deadlines, you focus on consistently embodying your values and trusting that this consistency will generate positive effects over time in ways you may never directly observe. You plant forests knowing you may never see the mature trees, contribute to conversations knowing you may never learn how your words influence someone's thinking, invest in relationships knowing the full impact of your caring may not become apparent for years. This shift to process orientation requires developing what we might call existential patience, the capacity to find meaning and satisfaction in the quality of your efforts, rather than in the speed or visibility of the results those efforts produce. This patience isn't passive waiting, but active engagement with the present moment's opportunities for expressing virtue and creating value. It's the patience of the gardener who tends the soil, plants the seeds, provides water and nutrients, and trusts in the natural processes of growth rather than trying to force plants to mature faster than their nature allows. This natural approach to personal development and positive influence recognizes that sustainable change happens gradually through accumulated choices and consistent practice, rather than dramatic interventions or sudden breakthroughs. While breakthrough moments certainly occur and can be profoundly meaningful, they typically emerge from long periods of steady preparation rather than appearing randomly or being forced through willpower alone. The recognition of this natural rhythm of development creates space for what we might call developmental self-compassion, the ability to be patient and encouraging with yourself as you work to develop new capacities and ways of being. Instead of demanding immediate perfection or becoming discouraged when progress feels slow, you can appreciate the gradual nature of genuine transformation and celebrate small improvements along the way. This self-compassion becomes especially important when you're working to change deeply ingrained patterns that have served protective functions in your life. The tendency to seek external validation, to avoid difficult conversations, to control outcomes through worry and manipulation, these patterns often developed as reasonable responses to challenging circumstances earlier in your life. Transforming them requires not only developing new skills and perspectives, but also grieving the loss of strategies that once provided a sense of safety, even if they no longer serve your highest good. The process of releasing old patterns while developing new ones can feel destabilizing and uncertain. There may be periods when you feel like you're no longer who you used to be, but haven't yet become who you're growing into. This liminal space between identities can be uncomfortable, but it's also sacred. It's where transformation happens, where new possibilities emerge, where you discover capacities you didn't know you possessed. The Stoics understood this transformational process as a kind of philosophical death and rebirth, the dissolution of false identities based on external validation and circumstantial approval, and the emergence of authentic identity based on character and virtue. This process isn't completed once, but continues throughout life, as you encounter new challenges that call forth previously undeveloped aspects of your potential. This ongoing nature of personal development means that there's no final destination where you achieve perfect wisdom or complete emotional mastery and then coast on your accomplishments. There are always new depths of understanding to explore, new capacities to develop, new ways to contribute to the well-being of others. This endless possibility for growth becomes a source of excitement and purpose, rather than pressure or overwhelm, when you approach it with curiosity and patience rather than ambition and attachment. The shift from achievement-oriented to growth-oriented living creates what we might call sustainable motivation, drive that comes from the intrinsic satisfaction of developing your capabilities and expressing your values rather than from the need to reach specific goals or gain particular rewards. This motivation doesn't depend on external recognition or favorable circumstances to maintain itself. It's fueled by the natural human desire to become more skillful, more wise, more capable of contributing meaningfully to life. This intrinsic motivation becomes particularly important when you're working on challenges that matter deeply to you, but may not yield quick or obvious results. Whether you're developing artistic abilities, building meaningful relationships, creating positive change in organizations, or contributing to causes larger than yourself, the work often requires sustained effort over long periods with uncertain outcomes. The ability to find satisfaction in the process itself, rather than only in the results, becomes essential for persistence and resilience. The cultivation of this process-based satisfaction gradually transforms your entire relationship with time and effort. Instead of viewing your daily activities as mere stepping stones toward future rewards, or as obligations you must endure to reach some distant state of happiness, you begin to discover fulfillment in the immediate experience of applying yourself skillfully to whatever tasks or challenges are before you. This shift doesn't eliminate your interest in achieving goals or creating positive outcomes, but it removes the desperate edge that makes so much human striving feel anxious and unsustainable. This transformation in your relationship with effort and time creates what we might call present moment mastery, the ability to be fully engaged with whatever you're doing right now, regardless of whether it's something you would have chosen or something circumstances have required of you. This mastery recognizes that the quality of your life is determined not by what happens to you, but by how you meet whatever happens with attention, skill, and integrity. The practice of present moment mastery begins with simple activities that you might normally rush through or perform while thinking about something else. When you're washing dishes, you can focus completely on the temperature of the water, the texture of the soap, the satisfaction of transforming something dirty into something clean. When you're walking from one place to another, you can attend to the sensation of your feet contacting the ground, the rhythm of your breathing, the countless details of your environment that normally pass unnoticed. These moments of complete presence might seem insignificant, but they're actually profound training in the art of living fully. Each time you choose to be completely where you are, rather than mentally somewhere else, you're developing the capacity for what the Stoics called attention to the present, the recognition that this moment is the only one in which you actually have any power, or in which life is actually happening. This attention to the present naturally extends to your interactions with other people. Instead of half listening while planning what you want to say next, you can practice giving others your complete attention, really hearing not just their words, but the emotions and experiences behind those words. Instead of relating to others primarily as sources of information, entertainment, or validation, you can appreciate them as unique expressions of human consciousness, each carrying their own struggles, insights, and possibilities for growth. This quality of presence becomes a gift you offer to everyone you encounter. In a world where most people feel rushed, distracted, and only partially seen by others, your capacity to be fully present becomes a rare and valuable contribution. People often remember encounters with someone who was completely there with them, who listened without agenda, who saw them clearly without judgment. These moments of being truly witnessed can have profound effects on people's sense of worth and possibility. The development of this quality of presence requires releasing the constant mental commentary that usually accompanies your experiences. Most people live with an ongoing inner narrator that's constantly evaluating, comparing, planning, and worrying. This narrator isn't necessarily problematic, but when it becomes the dominant feature of your inner experience, it can prevent you from directly encountering life as it's actually unfolding. The practice of stepping back from this mental commentary doesn't mean trying to stop thinking altogether, but rather learning to observe your thoughts without being completely identified with them. You can notice when your mind starts spinning stories about what certain events mean, creating fantasies about future scenarios, or replaying past conversations, and gently return your attention to what's actually happening right now. This practice of disidentification from thought creates space for what we might call direct experience, encountering life through your senses, emotions, and intuition, rather than only through conceptual understanding. This direct experience often reveals richness and beauty in ordinary moments that thinking about those moments obscures. The taste of food becomes more vivid when you're not thinking about what you need to do later. The experience of physical movement becomes more satisfying when you're not mentally planning your next activity. Conversations become more meaningful when you're not formulating your responses while the other person is still speaking. This capacity for direct experience naturally cultivates what the Stoics called gratitude, not as a mental exercise or moral obligation, but as a spontaneous response to recognizing the abundance that surrounds you in every moment. When you're truly present, you begin to notice countless things that normally remain invisible. The complexity of light and shadow, the miracle of your body's automatic functions, the intricate web of cooperation that makes even simple activities possible. This gratitude isn't dependent on having perfect circumstances or getting everything you want. It emerges from appreciating what is actually available to you right now. The capacity to think and feel and choose, the opportunity to contribute to others' well-being, the endless possibilities for learning and growth that each day presents. This appreciation creates a sense of fundamental richness that doesn't depend on accumulating more possessions, achieving higher status, or reaching some future state of satisfaction. The recognition of this inherent richness naturally leads to what we might call generous living, approaching life from a sense of abundance rather than scarcity, contributing rather than hoarding, sharing rather than competing. When you're not constantly worried about whether you have enough or whether you're good enough, you become free to focus on how you can be useful, how you can add value, how you can make whatever situations you're in a little better through your presence and efforts. This generous approach extends to how you think about your own development and the development of others. Instead of viewing personal growth as a competitive process where some people succeed and others fail, you begin to see it as a collaborative endeavor where everyone's progress contributes to collective elevation. Your own development becomes a gift you offer to everyone whose life you touch, and others' growth becomes something that enhances your own possibilities rather than threatening your position or importance. This collaborative approach to growth creates what we might call developmental synergy, the recognition that individual and collective flourishing are mutually reinforcing rather than competing priorities. When the people around you are operating from inner strength rather than inner neediness, when they're responding from wisdom rather than reacting from fear, when they're contributing from fullness rather than taking from emptiness, your own life becomes more enjoyable and meaningful. This synergy reveals one of the most profound insights of Stoic philosophy. True self-interest and genuine concern for others' well-being ultimately point in the same direction. When you help others develop their capacity for wisdom, emotional regulation, and meaningful contribution, you create conditions that support your own continued growth and satisfaction. When you contribute to building communities and relationships characterized by mutual respect, honest communication, and shared commitment to virtue, you create environments where your own highest capacities can flourish. The recognition of this fundamental harmony between individual and collective good naturally leads to what we might call enlightened citizenship, participation in your various communities, with awareness of how your choices affect overall quality of life for everyone involved. This citizenship expresses itself differently depending on your circumstances and capabilities, but it always involves taking responsibility for your impact on the systems you're part of, rather than just focusing on what you can extract from those systems. In your workplace, it might involve doing excellent work, regardless of whether it's immediately recognized, treating colleagues with respect, even when they're difficult to deal with, and contributing to problem solving rather than just complaining about problems. In your broader community, it might mean participating in local organizations, supporting businesses that align with your values, or simply being a positive presence in your neighborhood. Someone who contributes to the overall sense of safety, friendliness, and mutual care that makes communities thrive. These contributions don't need to be dramatic or time-consuming. They simply need to reflect your recognition that you're part of something larger than yourself, and that your choices matter for the whole. This sense of meaningful participation in something larger than your individual concerns creates what we might call existential fulfillment, the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that your life contributes to the ongoing story of human development and flourishing. This fulfillment doesn't depend on being famous or achieving anything that will be remembered by history. It comes from the intrinsic meaning of living according to your highest values and using whatever capabilities you have in service of what genuinely matters. The cultivation of this existential fulfillment requires ongoing reflection on what genuinely matters to you beneath all the conditioning and expectations you've absorbed from your culture, family, and social environment. Many people spend their entire lives pursuing goals that seemed important because of external messages about success and happiness, without ever examining whether those goals actually serve their authentic values and natural capabilities. This examination often reveals that what you most deeply want is quite simple: to be useful, to grow throughout your life, to contribute to others' well-being, to express your authentic self through your choices and actions, to experience the satisfaction that comes from meeting challenges with courage and wisdom. These desires don't require dramatic life changes or extraordinary circumstances to fulfill. They can be expressed through whatever opportunities and relationships are available to you right now. The recognition that fulfillment is available through your current circumstances rather than through some future achievement creates what we might call immediacy of purpose. The understanding that the meaningful life you're seeking can begin right now, with the next choice you make, the next person you encounter, the next challenge you face. You don't need to wait for perfect conditions or complete self-understanding to start living according to your highest values and contributing positively to the world around you. This immediacy of purpose transforms even mundane activities into opportunities for practicing virtue and expressing your authentic self. The way you handle frustration when technology doesn't work properly becomes a chance to practice patience. The way you respond when someone treats you unfairly becomes an opportunity to embody justice and wisdom. The way you approach tasks you don't particularly enjoy becomes practice in finding meaning through service rather than only through personal preference. As you continue to approach daily life in this way, consistently choosing your highest response rather than your most habitual reaction, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to experience what the Stoics called the good life. Not a life free from difficulty or disappointment, but a life lived with such integrity and wisdom that you can face whatever comes with confidence in your ability to respond well. This confidence doesn't come from believing that everything will work out exactly as you want, but from trusting in your capacity to find meaning and maintain your essential well-being regardless of external circumstances. This is the ultimate promise of Stoic philosophy. Not that life becomes easy, but that you become equal to life's challenges. Not that you get everything you want, but that you discover sources of satisfaction that don't depend on getting what you want. Not that others always treat you well, but that your happiness doesn't require others to behave in any particular way. Not that you never experience pain or loss, but that you can meet these experiences with grace and learn from them rather than being defeated by them. The person who has cultivated these capacities has achieved something far more valuable than any external success or acquisition. They have become truly free. Free from the anxiety that comes from needing things to be different than they are. Free from the resentment that comes from demanding that others meet their expectations. Free from the depression that comes from defining themselves by their failures and limitations. Free from the desperation that comes from believing their worth depends on external validation. This freedom isn't an escape from life, but a deeper engagement with it. When you're no longer spending most of your energy protecting yourself from discomfort or trying to control outcomes beyond your influence, you have tremendous resources available for creating, contributing, learning, and loving. When you're not constantly worried about your image or position, you can take risks that allow for genuine growth and meaningful impact. When you're not attached to specific results, you can invest wholeheartedly in worthwhile endeavors, while remaining open to whatever lessons and opportunities emerge along the way. This is the transformation that Stoic philosophy makes possible. Not a change in your external circumstances, but a fundamental shift in how you relate to whatever circumstances arise. And from this shift flows everything else: greater resilience, deeper relationships, more meaningful work, increased capacity for joy and wonder, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing that whatever life presents, you have within yourself everything necessary to meet it with wisdom, courage, and grace.